Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second part, basically, of our episode. We're still talking with the wonderful Elizabeth Shope, but now we've kind of moved over to the Johnstown Johnstown Flood National Memorial, and we're wondering about the tie in between the two. So we're just going to kind of pick up where we left off with Lake Conemaugh. That was the tie-in that was built for the main line. And anybody's familiar with the Johnstown flood knows about that, which we'll cover that all as we go. So the the original building of the dam, which I want everybody to think it was built by the railroad, and it would the dam was had actually broken what twice before.
So it was built by the state of Pennsylvania, and it was then owned by the Pennsylvania Railroad. So the Pennsylvania Railroad would purchase the entire right of way for the Pennsylvania Main Line Canal in 1857. So they would inherit the South Fork Dam as part of their purchase, and the Pennsylvania Railroad didn't. They built their own series of reservoirs. But I wanted to go back for just a second and mention that, funds were approved to build the South Fork Dam in 1836. It didn't get finished until the early 1850s. So it took a really long time to build the South Fork Dam. And as Tom mentioned, the tie-in with the Portage Railroad. So once it was finally built, it only served that original purpose for supplying the canal basin in Johnstown with water for just a few years, because by the later 1850s, it has a whole new owner, which is the Pennsylvania Railroad. And yeah, so it broke in 1862 when it was owned by the Pennsylvania Railroad. And there was a defect in near a defect in the foundation near the stone culvert at the base of the dam. And at that time, it had a lot of its original safety features. It had discharge pipes, it had a control tower, and in the control tower, you could control how fast or slow you let water out of the lake. It was not filled to capacity at that time. So they were able to slowly let the water drain out of the lake, and it didn't cause a lot of there wasn't a lot of attention on it. It got a mention in the newspaper, no loss of life. There was some property damage, washed away some timber in South Fork, some railroad tracks, and only put a few feet of water into the river. So it wasn't really something that was it wasn't a big break, like it was in 1889. The water was let out very gradually. But it was something that people would remember, definitely, and they would bring that up after the 1889 flood. They would say, well, we remember when this dam broke before, and it didn't cause a lot of death and destruction. So I can see why people weren't worried about the dam breaking, because they had experienced a break before.
And you mentioned the drain pipes, which after the dam was rebuilt again before the big break in 1889, they didn't put the pipes in. What happened to those, and why didn't they put them? Because I they were still there.
Yeah, so it's believed that it was owned by the state first, then the railroad, and then a man named John Riley from the Altoona area purchased the lake bed, which was empty at that time. So after the break in the early 1860s, it sat empty. John Riley purchased it, held on to it for a few years, and then he sold it at a loss to Benjamin Ruff, who was the first president of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, and that's the group that owned it on May 31st, 1889. So it's believed that he may have taken those pipes out to make up for, you know, the loss in selling the dam to Benjamin Ruff.
I
So
see.
taken out, sold for scrap is the theory.
Huh. And we're gonna talk about, and we'll hear about the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club a lot. There was some well-to-dos there. We mentioned earlier steel and stuff in Johnstown. We're talking people like Andrew Carnegie and Henry Clay Frick, and that were these were essentially almost kings of industry at
No,
the
so the
time.
South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club was a group of wealthy industrialists from Pittsburgh who were looking for somewhere outside of the city of Pittsburgh to spend time. And it's fairly easy to get to. You can take a train from Pittsburgh to South Fork. From there, you can take a carriage up from South Fork across the top of the dam to the clubhouse and cottages. So they would eventually build buildings right along the lake. So it was a nice escape from the busy industrial, humid city of Pittsburgh to come and enjoy some quiet time, some, you know, a nice mountain breeze on a hot day. So they were out of Pittsburgh. They were too far away if they needed to get back, but it was a nice quiet place. It's a few miles from South Fork, so it's nice and quiet here.
Yeah. In which you mentioned about taking the carriages right across the top of the dam. They actually slightly lowered the dam to accommodate the passage of carriages across.
Correct. Yeah. So there were some changes when the club rebuilt the dam. Those outlet pipes that you had mentioned earlier that were taken out were not replaced. The top of the dam was widened. There was sort of a sag in the middle. The level of the lake was higher. And there was a fish screen installed near the spillway to keep the fish that the club stocked in the lake from, you know, going down into getting out of the dam where other people would be able to catch those fish. So a lot of different changes done to what the club would call Lake Conemaugh, and that would prove to not be such great changes as we move through the 1880s.
And you'd mentioned the clubhouse before, which that's also really neat to see. And if you think about it now, it's right in the middle of town. But
Yes.
before, that was all lake water. That gives you an idea of how big the lake was.
Yes. No, the landscape has changed quite a bit since then. So and you're right, I always tell people that, you know, they can drive past the clubhouse and some of the remaining cottages that sat right along the lakeshore, but you have to use your imagination because the present day town of St. Michael grew up in, you know, where in the empty lake bed. So when you drive past the clubhouse and cottages, it seems like you're driving through the community, but those would have been the only structures that were out there for the most part. There were some farms and things around where the lake was around the area, but right on the lakeshore, it was just the clubhouse and cottages.
Exactly, in which, you know, to visit the visitor center there at the Flood Memorial Park, you basically drive through the almost the very bottom of the original lake bed itself, past the dam to get to where the visitor center is.
Yeah, on your way into the park, you're sort of doing a loop around where the lake was. Yeah, you're sort of driving through where the lake would have been through St. Michael and then sort of following the outline of the lake up to the visitor center.
Which also that's a fun place to visit because that's uh I can't, I'm gonna be honest, I can't remember his name. The basically the supervisor's house was there.
Oh, Colonel
Um
Unger, he
yes.
was so Benjamin Ruff would pass away a few years before 1889. So Colonel Unger would become the second president of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. So at the park we have his farmhouse is park offices today. And the visitor center is built to look like the barn that sat on his property. So if you are standing on the dam looking up at the hillside here, it looks very similar to what it would have looked like in the 1880s.
And that's really neat because yeah, I didn't even think about anybody again with familiar with the area. If you go up, what's our modern day 219 now, you get a you can see the dam, you can see the buildings at quick glance if you know where to look, and actually even the spillway you can see because the spillway was not a part of the dam itself.
Yeah, so you can see the hillside here going across 219, and yeah, if you know where to look, you can see the dam abutments.
And that's what I was going to ask you was because I didn't know if the visitor center if that was supposed to be like a barn or something. I did not actually know that.
Yeah, so there is a photograph taken in the 1880s of the hillside with the original barn that sat on the property. So it looks very similar to that today.
And it's super unique, which that's another one again I recommend everybody going. We actually visited there. I took my youngest son and he loved it. It's not big, but there's a lot of interest there, and you can even just come spend 15 minutes at least. It's really nice.
Yeah, we have a park movie that's 35 minutes long, and then we have 2 floors of exhibits that talk about the history of the South Fork Dam, the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, the flood, and some of the recovery efforts.
So we've had our triumph, and we talked about the building of the railroad and stuff. So now I guess we have to. I guess we'll counter that with tragedy, the Great Flood of in Johnstown of 1889, which was, long story short, the direct result of this dam failing when it was at full capacity.
Yeah, so the South Fork Dam broke on Friday, May 31st, 1889 at about 3:10 p.m. Sending 20 million tons of water 14 miles down the Conemaugh Valley to Johnstown. It would go through the towns of South Fork, Mineral Point, East Conemaugh, Woodvale, and Johnstown. And scientists who have done estimates on how much water is 20 million tons of water, they equate that to the force of the Niagara River as it reaches the falls. So if you imagine turning on the power of Niagara Falls down the Conemaugh Valley for the 35 minutes that it took the lake to drain, that is hard to imagine the power of the water that was unleashed on the Conemaugh Valley that
and
day.
and almost like a perfect storm. Unprecedented rainfall leading up to the steepness of the river valley and the gorge down through. And the fact that even before the dam broke, Johnstown was pretty well flooded anyway. It was very common for Johnstown to flood.
Yeah, there were a lot of factors that you mentioned. So you have the dam not in the best shape. You have 30,000 people living in the Conemaugh Valley and building closer and closer to river's edge. You have a large timber industry. You have the geography of the Conemaugh Valley. Right, you're right. Johnstown was used to spring flooding. People said that was springtime in Johnstown. So I imagine many people on the morning of May 31st, the streets were full of water. That wasn't necessarily cause for alarm. Now, as the day progressed, this was the most water that people had seen in the streets. And you also had rumors throughout the 1880s that the South Fork Dam was going to break. And going back to that 1862 break, there were people that said, well, the dam broke before and we were fine. And they were, and there's no way that they would have known of all of the changes that had taken place here. So some people were very worried about what would happen if the dam were to break. And other people said, there were people who every time it rained would say that today's the day the South Fork Dam is going to break. So unfortunately, it was said quite often throughout town. And there were a lot of events that made people feel one way or another about the possibility of the dam breaking.
Yeah, a little bit of the boy that cried wolf syndrome almost.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it was said a lot, and people who left their homes at some point in the day when the water became too high for comfort. David McCullough in his book used the word, I believe it was sheepishly. They went sheepishly across town because people knew the looks that they were going to get for leaving their homes, or when they were coming back. And it was just another rainstorm, and the South Fork Dam held like it always did. But unfortunately, all of those factors that we talked about earlier just all came together, unfortunately, on May 31st and created the events of that day.
Yeah, in which we'll actually just talk about the dam a little bit more on that day for brief. It They had basically patched it with loose dirt and straw. It wasn't engineering at all. They just filled holes in with whatever they had.
Yeah, so when the dam was rebuilt, no engineer was consulted. Also at that time, you didn't have to have someone looking at what you were doing, but thankfully now we have groups and organizations who dam safety, Army Corps of Engineers and things that check up on those things now, but that was not a requirement at that time. And yeah, using whatever materials were at hand to get the dam ready to fill it back up from that break in the early 1860s. So it sat empty from the early 1860s until the club rebuilt the dam.
Yeah, and to think it could still happen. This is a little off topic, but we think about Johnstown. They've had quite a few great floods. 1977 was another one. We're not as big, but there was a couple of dams that failed then that really increased the floodwaters in Johnstown. So they don't call it the flood city for nothing.
Yeah, so unfortunately, Johnstown has had other major floods since 1889. There was the St. Patrick's Day flood in 1936, and then July of 1977.
Yeah, and which we'll go back. I mean, even in '89, Johnstown was a bustling city. You had uh the Cambria Iron Works, which was not one of Carnegie's mills. It was a direct competitor to his, but it was one of the leading steel producers in the world at the time.
The Cambria Iron Company, that was the big business in Johnstown in the 1880s. Most people knew someone that worked for Cambria Iron, had someone in their family that worked there. So yeah, large output coming from the iron company in Johnstown.
And I bring that up because it sort of loops. There was a member of the Cambria Iron Works that was also a member of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, which, if I'm not mistaken, he kind of joined the club so there was a local eye to keep track of the dam itself.
Daniel Morell was involved with the Cambria Iron Company, and he had sent up one of his engineers, John Fulton, to take a look at things and report back. And John Fulton saw some changes that he thought ought to be made. So there were some letters back and forth between Daniel Morell and Benjamin Ruff, the first president of the club. And nothing really came from that. Benjamin Ruff said at the end of one letter that you and your people are in no danger from our enterprise. So Daniel Morell would join the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. as a member, as a member of the club, but residing in Johnstown. And Dana Morrell would pass away a few years before the flood as well, but we highly respected in town, and didn't want to stop the club from doing what they were doing, offered to contribute to any changes that needed made, but was very much looking out for the folks in the Conemaugh Valley, and wanted to make sure that everything was as it should be with the South Fork Dam or Lake Conemaugh.
Right. And we've mentioned a few times already David McCullough's book. I recommend anybody gets that. It is an excellent book, and it is very detailed about the Johnstown flood. That's basically where I did a lot of my research on about the Johnstown flood many years ago. So I recommend anybody gets it. It's excellent.
And we have a lot of people that come to the park because they've read the David McCullough book, which it's an excellent book, and people read that book and now they want to come to the park and see the place because they read the book and they want to see what they've read about.
So let's move to the flood itself. Now we talk about the flood. We're talking about a wall of water. How big was this wall of water that hit Johnstown?
Yeah, so that's it. A good question. It varied. As it's making its way down the Conemaugh Valley, it's gathering more and more debris as it goes. And a lot of people who witnessed the flood said that they couldn't see the water. They saw everything that the flood had accumulated. So you saw all of the debris coming. So that's how many people described it. As it's going to Johnstown, it has sort of a renewed intensity. There were some places coming down the Conemaugh Valley where it would slow down a little bit, and then sort of continue with more force as it keeps going. But yeah, and many people described seeing the debris, and also something that a lot of people would mention that they called the death mist. So it's almost like holding your finger in front of a garden hose. So you have the debris in front of the water and you have that mist on the side. So that's how many people described it. They described it as like a roar like thunder.
I bet through everything under the sun in that water. The sheer intensity of it. Railroad boxcars and
yes, and just the power of water to be able to push 30-80 ton locomotives from 100 yards up to a mile downstream is such a powerful force.
Yeah, my goodness. That's even the focal point at the park. There is that whole wall, which is it looks as if the flood debris is bursting through the wall with stuff. And I'll post pictures on the website, but it's just a small portion of what must have looked like. I don't really know. I obviously wasn't there.
So that exhibit that you talk about, that's what most people saw. They saw all of the debris, animals, horses, miles of barbed wire. Just anything and everything.
Yeah, you mentioned the wire. That's one to think about. The wire mill was up East Conemaugh way, so that it picked all of that up as well before it headed into Johnstown, which the wire mill is every bit as big as Cambria Iron. So there's hundreds of miles of wire. I couldn't imagine a wave full of barbed wire coming at you.
No. Yeah. So the mill was close to Johnstown, and just bringing all of that with it as well. And many different experiences of people as the flood is coming into Johnstown. Some people saw it coming and had time to get out of the way. Some people didn't see it coming, just people being floated for, miles downstream, hanging on to, a roof, anything to try to just stay out of the water. There are accounts of people spending the night of May 31st hanging in trees because they're afraid of falling asleep and losing their grip and, falling into that churning water. I
It
just can't
must,
even, I just can't even imagine.
and it wasn't just residents of town. There were, you know, passengers on the railroad because the Pennsylvania Railroad then was pretty well halted at Johnstown because of all the rain and tracks were already washed out. So any even viable escape routes had been cut off.
Right. So flooding with the railroads, tracks washed out earlier in the day. Um, some trains stopped in East Conemaugh, couldn't make it any further. But then also, when you mention people in town, May 30th, the day before the flood, was Decoration Day, which later became Memorial Day. So there were who knows how many people visiting family or friends for
Yeah.
the holiday weekend as well.
Yeah, and incidentally, anybody that's familiar with Johnstown is familiar with the inclined plane now that was built just after that for just such an emergency to evacuate people because Johnstown, oh, as I like to say, there's only one way into Johnstown. It's downhill. It's all downhill into town. It's at the bottom.
Yes, it's, built on a nearly level floodplain. And you mentioned the incline plane, and for me, that was my whoa moment when I first started working here and I went to that view of Johnstown, and you see the mountains rising out of Johnstown, and you see Johnstown, almost at the bottom of a like this big bowl, so to speak. But yes, the incline plane was a nice um opportunity for people to live outside of the city after the 1889 flood. A lot of people want to move to higher ground, you know, um, but still work in the mills in town. So that was a nice way to be able to go in and out of the city. You can still get to work, but you're not necessarily living in Johnstown.
And it's people don't realize if you've never been there, you don't realize it's steep. It's the steepest in the world.
It is steep.
Uh, and now after the flood, we also have the famous stone bridge. It's still there to this day. But in essence, after everything calmed down with all that debris, you basically had Lake Conemaugh reformed itself in Johnstown then afterwards, essentially.
A lot of that debris that comes into Johnstown is going to jam up at the Pennsylvania Railroad Stone Bridge. And unfortunately, a little bit after the flood, something starts a fire at the Stone Bridge. You have locomotives with fuel, you have um, coal stoves, you have all different kinds of things that could start a fire. And it's interesting because a lot of people said after the flood they didn't realize that this was just something that happened to Johnstown. You have the water, you have the flood, you have the fire at the bridge. People thought that this was Armageddon Day. This was happening everywhere. This was the end of times. And a lot of people also mentioned that fire at the Stone Bridge. You have a lot of people trapped in debris at the Stone Bridge, um, as well as debris of every kind. And a lot of people talked about how eerie that glow was, how bright the fire burned. You think about Johnstown after the flood, it gets to be dark. There are no electric lights anymore. All of town is dark, and your source of light is this fire burning at a bridge, and knowing that there are people trapped there was really just awful for people to think about. One man said that the fire burned so bright, you could read a newspaper.
I could believe. I mean, you think about how many houses, trees, everything just piled up there, and
Yeah.
they basically had to use dynamite to clear the debris pile. It was that entangled with railroad rail and just that. I mean, to look at the pictures, it's astounding.
It is there, so much debris there. So they brought in a man named Kirk, and he used dynamite at the stone bridge, and apparently felt like he wasn't making, as much progress as he, maybe it wasn't going as quick as he would have liked. So he set off like a 450-pound charge. And the residents of Johnstown were not very happy with that. But it took some time before you could, see daylight through those arches. I mean, you just have acres and acres of debris there, and just thinking about all of that debris, you have to cart it away, you have to burn it. And I think about the people who, like, what a long night May 31st would have been for those folks. People moving from their homes. People were afraid that, my house survived the flood, but is it going to stand until morning? So
Yeah.
going to surviving structures in town like Alma Hall, as different gathering places in town to stay the night. And June 1st, overcast like May 31st, but many people described it as a sunny day with blue skies. But it wasn't. But I think that really speaks to, the shock. And you imagine experiencing something like that. So I'm sure just people walking around in a total state of shock, sort of like
Yeah.
expressionless, using surviving structures like Alma Hall as a starting off point for trying to figure out where your home would have been, or using those structures to try and find where my house was. And
Yeah.
The people of Johnstown just immediately joined together, formed different committees amongst themselves to like a police force, and immediately had to start cleaning up and burying the victims of the flood, searching for victims of the flood. The temperatures remained relatively on the cool side for a few days after the flood, because also the spread of disease is a very real possibility after the flood too. Digging out basements, I mean, just it's amazing to me. I'm sure they didn't feel like doing that, but what a resilient group of people to be able to
Yeah.
band together, form these committees amongst themselves, get to work doing what they needed to do to clean up, to bury the dead. I mean, I'm in
Yeah.
awe
It's
of what they did in the days after
yeah, and
the
it's
flood.
astounding. And we're thinking about cleanup. We have to. I do kind of have to mention the one famous person everybody doesn't really think of, Clara Barton.
Yes.
We know the Red Cross today. Then it was in its infancy. This was the Red Cross's really big test of handling a massive disaster and done well at it.
Yes. Yeah. So for Clara Barton's newly formed American chapter, this is one of their first, um, big disasters. And she came to Johnstown just a few days after the flood. She was there until October. Brought a team of doctors and nurses with her. She built several Red Cross hotels, which were great for people to be able to get a clean pair of clothes, a bite to eat. You think about people after the flood who have only the clothes on their back. I mean, they have nothing left. There's no food. So there's also this real sense of urgency of being able to get supplies into Johnstown,
And that's
of all supplies of all kinds. I
yeah.
mean, you need medical attention, but you also need a doctor. You also need coffins to bury the dead. I mean,
Yeah.
it just so much was needed, and a wonderful relief effort. Claire Barton, but also like donations coming in from all over the country and all over the world. Lots of countries sent money to Johnstown. You had school children who gave up their lunch money to send donations to town. Penitentiaries baking bread and sending food to Johnstown. But also food and supplies for the folks in the Conemaugh Valley, but then thinking about everybody coming in to assist with the cleanup and the rebuild. And so you have a lot of people who need supplies, but then you also have a lot of people coming into Johnstown in the days after the flood as well.
And that's I try to impress upon the scope of it. To think about it, it was the single greatest tragedy as far as loss of life up until we had our September 11th terrorist attacks. That you think that is the scope of what it was, how long that went. That a great tragedy.
A major tragedy. Yeah, so 2,209 is the official number of those who lost their lives in the Great Johnstown Flood of 1889. But you had 99 entire families that were lost. So a few things that we had mentioned previously, there would have likely been people whose family or friends didn't know they were in Johnstown because they were just there for the holiday weekend. Or with the railroad, a lot of people moving in and out of Johnstown. You come to Johnstown, you stay for a few days, you leave, or Johnstown is a place to rest before you move on to Pittsburgh or somewhere else. You had people like Victor Heiser, whose account you mentioned that you can listen to in the visitor center. He was a 16-year-old orphan survivor who decided to leave Johnstown. So there were others like him who left town in the days after the flood, who were counted among the dead, who turned up as being alive years later. But you also think about, like John Smith is missing, but maybe he just moved to town, so he doesn't really know a lot of people. Or all of John Smith's family dies in the flood too, so there's no one to say, wait, he's not here anymore. But so that's the official number, but we don't really know. It's likely a lot more than that. It also doesn't account for people who died as a result of, you survived the day of May 31st, and maybe died a couple months later as a result of an injury or illness or something associated from the day of May 31st. But that is the official number. And the list of the victims of the flood was passed around town. So that's those names are listed on the historical record of the victims of the flood. And that's really why our park is here today. We are here to preserve the remains of the South Fork Dam and to remember those 2,209 people that died in the flood.
Yeah, and we'll go back. How long did the cleanup take? Just so there's an idea.
Oh, months,
Darn
years.
good question, huh?
That is a good question, and that's a hard question. If you came into Johnstown by way of train in 1892, 1893, it would have been hard to tell that a devastating flood had hit the city a few years before. Um, so while I'm sure it felt like a lifetime to the people who were living there, they really cleaned up, you know, I mean, immediately started that cleanup effort and just kept going, and I think it's very impressive that a few years later you know it looked like this flood hadn't happened, and many people rebuilt right where they had lost their homes. You know and just also, when you mentioned the rebuilding, it makes me think of, like the Camber Iron Company, for example. We talked about them earlier.
Mhm.
They wanted to get operations going as soon as possible. We mentioned the amount of people employed by the Camber Iron Company, and trying to give a sense of normalcy after this tragic event. Thinking about Johnstown the days after the flood, Johnstown was a bustling town, as you had mentioned. So think about, you're not hearing the factory whistles. You're not, constant trains coming in and out all the time, wagons on the cobblestones. It would have been, almost like an eerie silence, and a stillness in Johnstown. So Cambria Iron wanted to get people back to work as soon as possible. So, hearing the factory whistle, seeing people that you knew going back to work, was a sign of yes, this devastating flood happened here, but we're moving forward. And I think that would have been a good thing for people to have. They wouldn't have had like a sense of normalcy because things
Yeah,
were so different, but to see familiar things starting to happen again.
a sort of comfort, really. As weird as that sounds, but that so that and that seems like that's about a good a place as any to end. But it was great talking to you. So we started with triumph, tragedy, and then we finished with triumph because we had to clean up. So before we go, any closing thoughts or anything on the Johnstown flood that I missed? Because there's so much that we could have covered.
There
We
is so
couldn't
much.
cover
We
it
could
all.
talk for
Yeah,
days. Yes, yeah. So you're right. It's a challenge to fit it into
yeah,
into one episode, but I think we hit a lot of the main points. And yeah, I would just end with, the resiliency of the folks in the Conemaugh Valley after the Johnstown flood, and their sense of community and coming together, and everybody pitching in to do what's needed and to help each other out, is very inspiring.
very. And Elizabeth, thank you for taking the time today to talk to us. And again, we mentioned in the last one as far as pitching in. If you get a chance, volunteer anywhere, help your national park out. You might just learn something new while you're at it.
Yes, we always welcome volunteers. We welcome your visit to both of our parks. We're open every day from 9 to 5, and website's the best way or our Facebook page to see what's coming up. We have lots of events planned around May 31st throughout the summer at both parks. So we invite you to come visit us. Thank you so
Wonderful.
much for your time.
Thank you for joining us. That has been a ton of fun to talk about it.
Yes, this has been great. Thank you so much.